Welcome to the deep dive. We're tackling a pretty big question today. How do we make sense of, the patterns of history, maybe even get a glimpse of what's coming next?
Yeah, it's a huge topic.
And for you, our listener, who's keen to build your knowledge without getting totally bogged down, we think we've got something, well, really interesting to unpack.
We're diving into a really compelling idea. It was put forward by Jorge Majfood back in 2022, and he detailed it in his 2024 book, Bosquejo de una teoría del poder, PEDT.
Which translates roughly to?
Something like Outline of a Theory of Power, P equals DT. And look, this isn't just, another history book. Majfood offers this, well, surprisingly simple equation.
An equation for history.
Yeah, sounds a bit odd, but he believes it helps explain the dynamics of power and, crucially, how much dissent a ruling power will tolerate across different times, different cultures.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Let's break that equation down. P equals DT. So P is
hegemonic power. And Majfood stresses this doesn't have to be like total absolute control to act dictatorially. It's the dominant force.
Got it. Dominant power. And D.
D stands for dissent. But it's broad thing, diversity of thought, culture, politics, economics, and really importantly, freedom of expression.
Okay. Dissent and diversity. And T.
T is the power's tolerance of all that D, how much it's willing to put up with.
So power equals dissent times tolerance. P equals DT. Simple on the surface, like you said, but I'm guessing there's more to it.
Oh, absolutely, because you can rearrange it, right? You get T equals D. Tolerance equals power divided by dissent.
Ah, okay.
And this gives us a key insight. Think about it like this. Tolerance, the amount of dominant power shows, it's almost like a resource it has.
A resource.
Yeah. So if the amount of dissent that challenges the differing voices, that D, if that goes up, then unless the power itself, P, also gets significantly stronger, well, that tolerance, TD, is probably going to shrink.
That makes sense. So if you feel secure, P is high, maybe you can afford more T, shrug off disagreements.
Exactly.
But if you feel your grip is weakening, P feels lower relative to D, you might clamp down.
Well,
really is IT T.
Precisely. It's all about that shifting balance.
And Majfood takes this even further, doesn't he? Something about equilibrium.
He does, yeah. He suggests this kind of zero-sum idea where PDT equals zero, like a balanced state.
Okay.
And his thinking is, when this equation gets significantly out of whack, when it's far from zero, that could signal instability, maybe even predict upheaval.
Upheaval like?
Revolution.
Potentially.
Yeah.
A moment where one power structure might get replaced by another. He uses this notation, pay P equals PC, then PC pay, leading to DC.TC data TA. Basically, a new power emerges. Pay C becomes stronger than the old one, pay.
And the new power has its own relationship between dissent and tolerance, its own D and T.
Exactly, its own balance point.
So we're using this almost mathematical lens to look at history. It's definitely a fresh way to connect events, maybe spot some logic we missed. Let's get into some examples, see how it works.
Sound good.
First, this core idea, tolerance relating to the balance of power. How does that play out? Well, what's really fascinating is how a power that feels vulnerable, maybe weaker, often reacts by becoming less tolerant. Think about a tiny startup versus a huge market leader.
Okay.
The startup might be super sensitive to any criticism, right? While the giant corporation can often just ignore it.
Yeah, good analogy.
Similarly, a hegemonic power, one with very little serious opposition, can sometimes actually benefit from appearing tolerant. It can boost its legitimacy, make it look fair and confident.
It's saying, look how strong we are. We don't even need to silence these critics.
Exactly. It enhances their image both at home and abroad. But, and this is key, this logic always comes back to that central balance of power.
Right. So let's take an example. You mentioned Jesus. How does PIT apply there?
Well, think about the Roman Empire and the ruling Jewish class at the time. They generally tolerated a fair amount of religious diversity and expression, as long as it didn't challenge their political control. Their T was okay for certain kinds of D.
But Jesus' message?
His message, even though largely nonviolent, started to gain influence. His critiques of wealth, of the existing power structures, that was seen as a dangerous form of dissent. It wasn't a military threat, but it challenged the social and, importantly, the political pillars of their hegemony.
So their tolerance for that specific kind of dissent dropped sharply because it was perceived as a real threat to their power.
Precisely. It crossed a red line.
And a few centuries earlier, Socrates in Athens.
Similar dynamic.
Very similar. Athenian democracy, for all its advancements in philosophy and thought, still had its limits. Socrates' method, his constant questioning of everything, societal norms, the god.
Questioning the unquestionable.
Right. It was seen by some powerful figures as undermining the very fabric of their society. His particular brand of dissent touched those, as Mudgefoot puts it, sensitive nerves of power, leading to his trial and execution. Their tolerance ran out. Okay, so moving forward in time, Europe. We often think of European history as, this march towards enlightenment and tolerance. But Mudgefoot's framework reminds us there were intense periods of intolerance, like the Crusades.
Absolutely. The Crusades weren't just about religion. They were also a response to the very real political and intellectual power of the Muslim world at that time.
So the infidel wasn't just religiously different, but also a major geopolitical rival, a threat to peace.
A huge threat. Their dissent was existing powerfully outside the Christian European sphere, challenging its dominance. The response was extremely low tolerance.
In the Inquisition. That feels like a mechanism for enforcing low tolerance.
Definitely. It was about enforcing ideological conformity. Think about the persecution of groups like the Cathars or Waldensians in the 12th century. Their religious beliefs were different, yes, but crucially, they challenged the authority and power of the Catholic Church.
So their dissent was met with brutal intolerance.
Right. Or look at the Spanish Reconquista. Mudgefoot points out that the intolerance shown by Spanish Catholicism then was often more severe than the relative tolerance found within the Islamic world, which was actually the dominant hegemonic power in that region for a long time.
That's a fascinating comparison. Higher P allowing for potentially higher T.
It suggests that, yeah. And then, of course, the violent suppression of the Protestant Reformation in the 16th century. Again, dissenting religious ideas were seen as a direct threat to political stability and the power of Catholic monarchs and the church. Tolerance plummeted.
It's this recurring pattern, isn't it? Power feels challenged, tolerance takes a nosedive.
It seems to be a consistent dynamic.
Now let's tackle something that seems maybe contradictory. The fact that some really brutal empires, Britain, France, the U.S., also allowed a fair bit of freedom of expression within their own countries. How does the theory handle that?
This is where it gets really nuanced and I think quite insightful. You have these massive empires engaged in incredibly violent exploitative colonialism abroad.
All right, think of the East India Company, the Virginia Company. Pure exploitation machine.
Exactly. Brutal stuff. But at the same time, back in London or Paris or later Philadelphia, you have public spheres where people are debating liberty, rights, and criticizing the government to some extent.
The U.S. is such a stark example, isn't it? The First Amendment guaranteeing free speech right from the start.
Since 1776, yeah.
While the nation itself is built on chattel slavery. That freedom clearly didn't apply to enslaved black people or Native Americans or Mexicans later on.
Absolutely not. Their dissent wasn't tolerated at all. And even look at the Confederate Constitution in 1861. It fiercely protected private property, explicitly including enslaved people. But it also included a limited right to free speech, with the huge caveat that you couldn't question slavery or the power of the slaveholders. Dissent against the core power was forbidden, so T was 0 for that.
So tolerance had very clear boundaries, defined by the core interests of the powerful.
Precisely. And yet, within these empires, you do see examples of significant criticism being tolerated, at least up to a point. Karl Marx is a classic case.
Right, he lived in London.
Yeah, fled persecution elsewhere, ends up in England writing Das Kapital, this massive critique of British capitalism and colonialism. He was watched by the police, for sure, but his work wasn't banned. He wasn't jailed for writing it.
Later, John A. Hobson, with his book Imperialism, A Study. A direct critique of the British Empire.
Same sort of thing. He faced backlash, marginalization in academia, lost positions, but he wasn't thrown in prison.
So how does Mudgefoot explain this? Why
Sure.
tolerate critics like Marx or Hobson?
He talks about this in another book, Moscase en la Telaraña, Flies in the Web. His argument is basically that a dominant power that feels fundamentally secure, that isn't genuinely afraid of losing its core privileges.
It's not really threatened by this type of dissent.
Not fundamentally. So it can
Yeah.
actually benefit from tolerating some level of marginal criticism. It makes them look good.
How so?
It creates this appearance of openness, of fairness. See, they can say, we allow even harsh critics to speak. It bolsters their legitimacy without actually endangering their core power.
Sounds like a safety valve. Lets off steam, maybe.
Sort of. It allows dissenting voices to be heard, but not necessarily acted upon. And crucially, it reinforces the image of a free society, which itself strengthens the dominant power as long as the criticism doesn't really start to shake the foundations.
So it's a calculated tolerance. Manage dissent, don't let it get truly disruptive.
Yeah.
Okay, let's move into the 20th century. How does this PDT framework help us understand things like, say, anti-immigrant waves or McCarthyism?
The 20th century is full of examples. Think about the U.S. in the 1920s and 30s. There was intense anti-immigrant feeling and new laws targeting Southern Europeans and also anti-fascist refugees. This can be seen as a reaction, a perceived threat to the existing Anglo-Saxon cultural and political dominance, maybe amplified by anxieties about global changes, like the rise of fascism abroad, which actually had some surprising support among powerful business interests at the time.
So perceived threat goes up, tolerance goes down.
Seems like it. And then McCarthyism during the Cold War. Here you have the U.S. arguably at the peak of its global power after World War II.
Yeah, incredibly powerful.
Yet there was this intense period of intolerance towards anyone perceived as having communist sympathies. Even though the actual internal threat might have been relatively small, the perception of an ideological threat led to a significant clampdown. It suggests even immense power can feel insecure and reduce tolerance.
And we also have to remember the huge difference between freedoms in the mother countries versus the colonies, right?
Oh, absolutely vital point. The tolerance shown in London or Washington often stood in stark contrast to the brutal suppression of any dissent in the colonies or client states. Think of all the dictatorships propped up by Western powers.
Banana republics.
Exactly. Freedom of expression, high tolerance. That was often a privilege reserved for the citizens of the empire, not for the people being ruled or exploited. Their dissent was met with very low tolerance, often violence.
This brings us to Majfud's idea of a ladder of intolerance. Can you walk us through the steps?
Sure. He outlines basically 3 escalating levels of how dominant powers deal with dissent they don't like. Level 1 is harassment, discrediting, demonization.
Smear campaigns, propaganda.
Yeah, trying to marginalize dissidents, turn public opinion against them, make theirs seem illegitimate or dangerous.
Okay, step 1. What's step 2?
Step 2 is using the law. Implementing legal restrictions to limit freedom of speech, assembly, organization, making certain kinds of dissent illegal.
And step 3?
Step 3 is direct force. Police or military intervention. Crushing protests, installing military dictatorships, maybe even proxy wars to eliminate challenges to the established power. Maximum intolerance approaches 0.
We've definitely seen examples of those legal restrictions, step 2, even in countries that value free speech.
Absolutely. The U.S., again, has examples. The Sedition Act of 1798, passed not long after the First Amendment, actually made it a crime to criticize the government when they felt threatened internationally.
Wow.
And then the Sedition Act of 1918, during World War I, made it illegal to speak out against the war effort. Shows how even democracies can sharply reduce tolerance when power feels under serious threat.
That reminds me of Eugene Debs, the socialist leader jailed for opposing World War I under that act.
Exactly, a prime example. He was imprisoned. But it's interesting, he was eventually pardoned.
But only after the war was won and the socialist movement wasn't seen as such a big threat anymore.
Precisely. The war ended, the immediate threat perception decreased, the Socialist Party lost momentum, the Allied powers were consolidated, so the need for that extreme intolerance lessened. They could afford to release him.
It's a contrast to someone like, say, Mark Twain, right? He wrote some scathing critiques of imperialism later in his life.
He did. And while he certainly faced criticism, he wasn't imprisoned for it. Perhaps his dissent, while sharp, wasn't seen as fundamentally threatening the core power structure in the same way Debs's anti-war activism was during wartime.
And maybe, going back to that earlier point, letting Twain speak freely even reinforced the image of a tolerant society.
Could be part of it. Though we shouldn't forget, David Thoreau was jailed earlier for criticizing the Mexican-American War, so that line of tolerance definitely shifts depending on the context and the perceived threat.
And it's so common to just label any real challenge to the system as extremism, isn't it? Majfud mentions the abolitionists.
Yes. People fighting against slavery for basic human rights were widely attacked and demonized as dangerous radicals, as extremists threatening the entire social order.
Because they challenged the fundamental economic and political power of the time.
Exactly. What gets called extreme dissent is often just dissent that seriously questions the privileges of the powerful.
Okay, so wrapping this framework around history gives us a lot to think about. Looking ahead, using this PESDT formula, what does Majfud forecast for, say, the 21st century?
Well, based on his read of shifting global power dynamics, he makes a pretty bold forecast.
Which is?
He suggests we might see increasing tolerance within China as its global power continues to rise.
Interesting. And the flip side?
The flip side is a potential progressive decrease in tolerance in what he calls the Northwestern or Euro-American powers.
Why?
Because in his view, their relative global power is shifting, potentially decreasing relative to rising powers in the East. So if Pa becomes less than Pa,
Then logically, according to the formula, T-eta might become less than TB. Lower relative power could lead to lower tolerance for dissent.
that's the conjecture. He does say a more detailed analysis of this forecast is planned for a later study, so it's presented as a trajectory based on the theory.
Wow. That's definitely a significant prediction to chew on, derived from this simple-looking equation.
It really is. It frames current global tensions in a potentially different light.
Well, this deep dives into Jorge Majfud's theory, P equals dt, it's certainly given us a powerful new lens, hasn't it? A way to look at history, maybe anticipate the future.
Yeah, that seemingly simple equation really does offer a compelling framework. It helps untangle that complex dance between power, dissent, and tolerance.
What really strikes me is how it suggests tolerance isn't always about, inherent virtue. It can be a strategic calculation tied to how secure a power feels.
Exactly. It highlights that dynamic relationship, the power, the
Yeah.
challenges it faces, and its capacity or willingness to accommodate.
So, for you, our listener, as you go about your day, maybe think about this framework. How might it apply to current events? Where do you see this equation, PEDT, playing out in the power dynamics shaping our world right now?
It's a useful tool for analysis. And keeping that in mind, here's a final thought to maybe mull over. If tolerance, as Mashford suggests, is inversely related to how vulnerable a dominant power perceives itself to be,
Yeah.
then what does the level of tolerance, or perhaps more revealingly, the level of intolerance we observe in a society, what does that truly tell us about the underlying stability and maybe the future path of its dominant powers?
A provocative question indeed. Thanks for joining us on this exploration.